Everything began on the night when the wind forgot to breathe, and the stars started to hum like a buried choir beneath the sky. Out in the empty fields of Nebraska, where the golden waves of wheat reached the horizon like an ocean of silence, a man named Caleb Warren lived alone. His days were marked by the rhythm of engines, the sigh of cows, and the endless ticking of time that refused to heal. Caleb was 47 years old, a widower, a farmer, the kind of man whose heart had grown calloused by survival but still whispered for something more when the nights got long enough. The neighbors said he'd stopped going to church after his wife Lily passed. They said he didn't look at the sky the same way he used to. Maybe they were right. For Caleb, heaven had become something buried in dirt, not something shining above it. His farmhouse sat 3 miles outside the town of Harlan, a place so small it barely appeared on maps anymore. The population had dwindled to just under 300 souls, most of them over 60. The young had fled years ago, chasing dreams in cities that glittered with promises the plains could never keep. What remained were stubborn ghosts. Men who worked land their grandfathers had worked, women who kept gardens their mothers had planted, and a handful of believers who still filled the pews of First Baptist every Sunday morning, their voices thin but determined against the silence. Caleb had been one of them once. He and Lily had sat in the 4th row, right side, every Sunday for 12 years. She sang hymns with her eyes closed, her voice soft and pure, while he held the hymn book and mouthed the words, never quite brave enough to let his own voice be heard. After the service, they would walk home hand in hand along the dirt road, the prairie wind threading through her hair, and she would talk about everything and nothing, the sermon, the garden, the neighbors, the way the clouds looked like paintings that afternoon. Those walks felt like eternity in the best possible way. Then came the cancer. Stage 4, pancreatic. They gave her 6 months. She lasted 4. The funeral was small. The casket was closed. The preacher spoke about heaven and reunion and God's mysterious plan, but Caleb heard none of it. He stood there in his black suit, staring at the polished wood, wondering how something so final could be called a plan. Afterward, people brought casseroles and condolences. He thanked them quietly, stacked the dishes in his refrigerator, and never touched them. The house became a tomb he inhabited but did not live in. He woke before dawn, worked until dusk, ate whatever required the least effort, and fell asleep in front of the television with the sound turned down low. The silence was unbearable, but so was noise. Everything reminded him of her absence: the empty chair at the table, the untouched side of the bed, the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the bathroom, even though her soaps had long since been thrown away. Months became a year became 2. The grief never left, but it changed shape. It became a dull heaviness he carried everywhere, like stones sewn into his chest. People stopped asking how he was doing. They stopped inviting him to church potlucks. Eventually, they stopped noticing him at all, and Caleb preferred it that way. The farm itself was modest: 200 acres of wheat, a small barn with 6 dairy cows, a chicken coop that rattled with life every morning, and a battered red tractor that coughed black smoke but still ran. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had cleared it with his bare hands, pulling rocks from the soil and stacking them into walls that still stood along the property line. His father had modernized it, adding irrigation and machinery, turning it into something profitable. Caleb had inherited it all when his father passed, and for a while he and Lily had dreamed of passing it on to children they never had. Now it was just him and the wheat. The wheat never asked questions. It never looked at him with pity. It grew when the rain came and withered when it didn't, indifferent to his sorrow. He found comfort in that predictability. Every spring, he tilled the soil. Every summer, he watched the green shoots stretch toward the sun. Every autumn, he harvested. Every winter, he waited. The cycle repeated, season after season, and though it was monotonous, it was also stable. Grief could not disrupt the rhythm of growth and harvest. The land endured. So did he. But something had changed recently. It started small. So small, he almost didn't notice. The wind had become quieter, not absent, just muted, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The birds, too, had grown strained. They no longer sang in the mornings with their usual chaos. Instead, they gathered in silent clusters on the fence posts, watching the fields with an eerie stillness. Even the cows seemed restless, lowing softly at odd hours, their eyes wide and unfocused. Caleb dismissed it at first. Animals were animals. Weather was weather. The plains had always been unpredictable, but the feeling persisted, a low hum of unease that sat just beneath his ribs, like a second heartbeat he couldn't control. Then came the night of October 17th. The day had been ordinary. He'd spent the morning repairing a section of fence near the north field, the sun warm against his back, the smell of earth and sweat thick in the air. By noon, he'd driven into town for supplies. Feed for the cows, oil for the tractor, a loaf of bread, and a carton of eggs from the general store. Martha, the cashier, had smiled at him with that polite sadness people reserved for widowers, and asked if he was doing all right. He'd nodded, paid in cash, and left without lingering. Back at the farm, he'd unloaded the truck, fed the animals, and checked the irrigation lines. Everything was functioning. Everything was fine. By evening, he'd made himself a simple dinner: scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee, and eaten it in silence at the kitchen table, the television murmuring in the next room. Afterward, he washed the dishes, dried them, and set them back in the cupboard where Lily had always kept them. The sun set slowly that night, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. He stood on the porch for a long time, watching the light fade, the way he did most evenings. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and for a moment he felt the weight of his own smallness. Out here, he was nothing, a speck of dust on a spinning rock. The realization should have been crushing, but instead, it was oddly comforting. If he was nothing, then maybe his grief was nothing too. Maybe it would all dissolve eventually, swallowed by the vastness of the prairie and the indifference of time. But the stars that night were different. They appeared one by one as the darkness deepened, but instead of their usual distant coldness, they seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Caleb squinted, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him. He'd never been good with constellations. Lily had been the one who knew their names, who could point out Orion and Cassiopeia and tell him the stories behind them. Without her, the stars were just scattered light, beautiful but meaningless. Yet tonight, they felt closer, not in distance, but in presence, as though they were watching him. He shook the thought away, chalking it up to exhaustion. He'd been working hard lately, sleeping poorly. His mind was probably just tired. Still, he lingered on the porch longer than usual, his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, his gaze fixed on the sky. Then, just before midnight, the wind stopped. It didn't slow. It didn't fade. It simply ceased, as though someone had flipped a switch. The wheat, which had been swaying gently all evening, froze mid-motion. The distant hum of crickets vanished. Even the sound of his own breathing seemed muffled, swallowed by an unnatural silence that pressed against his ears like water. Caleb set down his mug and stepped off the porch, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The air felt thick, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, except the sky was clear. No clouds, no lightning, just stars, pulsing faintly, and a silence so deep it made his heartbeat sound like thunder. Then he saw it, a light, faint at first, hovering low over the north field, maybe a quarter-mile away. It wasn't the harsh white of a flashlight or the warm yellow of a lantern. It was softer, more ethereal, a pale blue silver that shimmered like moonlight on water. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, expanding and contracting as though breathing. Caleb's first thought was a plane, but planes made noise, and this was silent. His second thought was a drone, maybe someone from town playing a prank, but who would bother, and why? He stood there for a long moment, debating. Part of him wanted to go back inside, lock the door, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But a deeper part, the part that had been numb for so long, felt something stir, curiosity, or maybe longing. He wasn't sure which. He grabbed the flashlight from the porch railing and started walking. The gravel driveway gave way to dirt, then to grass, then to the tall wheat of the north field. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stalks in narrow bands of yellow light, but beyond its reach, the world was swallowed in shadow. Above, the stars continued their strange pulsing, and ahead the light hovered steady and patient, as though waiting for him. His footsteps were the only sound. Each one felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from an odd weight that seemed to press down from the sky itself. The air had grown colder, though not unpleasantly so. It felt clean, almost sterile, like the air after a heavy rain. As he walked, memories flickered through his mind unbidden. Lily's laughter, the sound of her voice calling his name from the kitchen, the way she used to rest her head on his shoulder while they sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set. He hadn't thought about those moments in months. They hurt too much. But now, they surfaced gently, without the usual stab of pain. Instead, they felt distant, like echoes from another life. The light grew brighter as he approached. It was directly ahead now, maybe 50 yards away, hovering just above the wheat. The closer he got, the more he could see its texture. It wasn't solid, but layered, like veils of luminous silk, folding and unfolding in impossible patterns. The wheat beneath it glowed faintly, as though absorbing the light. Caleb stopped 20 feet away, his breath shallow. The flashlight trembled in his hand. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to move. The light pulsed once, twice, and then began to contract, folding inward like a flower closing its petals. As it did, something emerged, a shape, tall, slender, neither fully solid nor fully transparent. It stood, or floated, Caleb couldn't tell, in the center of the light, its form constantly shifting, dissolving and reforming like smoke caught in a slow wind. It had no features he could discern, no eyes or mouth, yet he felt unmistakably that it was looking at him. The light emanating from it was soft but overwhelming, not blinding, but so pure that everything else seemed dim in comparison. Caleb's flashlight slipped from his hand and fell into the wheat with a soft thud. His knees buckled, but he didn't fall. He stood there, frozen, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The being, because that's what it was, he knew with absolute certainty, did not move toward him. It simply existed, radiating a presence so vast and ancient that Caleb felt like a child standing before an ocean for the first time. Awe and terror tangled together in his chest, indistinguishable from one another. Then, without warning, something shifted inside his mind. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't a voice. It was deeper than both, a vibration that resonated through his skull, his spine, his very bone. And with it came word, or the essence of words, translated instantly into meaning his consciousness could grasp. Do not be afraid. The phrase was simple, but the weight behind it was infinite. It carried compassion, patience, and something else he couldn't name. A recognition, as though this being knew him, had always known him, in ways he didn't know himself. Caleb tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his tongue useless. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. Nothing came out except a faint rasp. The being remained still, but the light around it brightened slightly, wrapping Caleb in warmth. Not physical warmth, but something deeper, a comfort that seeped into his chest and loosened the knot of fear coiled there. Another wave of thought moved through him. You have been chosen to witness, not because you are special, but because you are ready. Ready for what? The question formed in his mind, and the answer arrived before he could even finish thinking it. The shift, the awakening, the harvest. Images flooded his consciousness, not as pictures, but as knowing. He saw the earth from above, spinning slowly in the void, wrapped in threads of light invisible to human eyes. He saw cities pulsing with energy, forests breathing, oceans humming with frequencies older than language. And he saw people, millions of them, glowing faintly, some bright, some dim, connected by fine filaments of light that stretched between them like a vast living web. And then he saw the darkness, not evil, but shadow, dense pockets where the light struggled to reach. He felt it too, the heaviness, the forgetting, the way humanity had turned away from something it once knew. The separation is ending, the thought continued. What was divided will remember itself. What was asleep will awaken. Caleb gasped, his chest tight. The visions receded, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. He staggered, caught himself, and looked up at the being. It hadn't moved, but its presence felt softer now, less overwhelming, as though it had adjusted itself to accommodate his fragile human mind. You call us many names, it said. Angels, spirits, visitors, but we are simply messengers. "We have walked among you since the beginning, though you have forgotten how to see us." The being's form flickered, and for just an instant, Caleb glimpsed something beneath the light, a silhouette that was almost human, but not quite, taller, more graceful. Its limbs moved in ways that defied anatomy, bending and flowing like water. "We are the keepers of thresholds," it continued, "and the threshold you stand upon now is the greatest your kind has ever faced." "What threshold?" Caleb managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. The light pulsed, and the answer came. The rapture. The word hit him like a physical blow. The rapture. He'd heard that word 1,000 times in church. Reverend Matthews preaching about the end times, the trumpet call, the saved rising into the clouds while the world burned below. But the being's presence carried no judgment, no fire, no wrath, only a quiet, unbearable truth. "The rapture is not what you were taught," it said. "It is not an escape. It is a remembering, a return to what you always were." Caleb's mind reeled. "But in the Bible says," the thought interrupted him gently, "your scriptures speak in symbols because truth is too vast for words. The rapture has already begun, not in the sky, but in the soil of human hearts. Those who feel the call, who remember the light within them, are already crossing the threshold. The veil is thinning. Soon, it will dissolve entirely." "Crossing to where?" Caleb's voice cracked. "Heaven? Heaven is not a place," the being replied. "It is a frequency, a state of being. You have always lived within it, but your awareness has been closed. The awakening is the opening." Tears streamed down Caleb's face, though he didn't know why. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was something raw, a recognition so deep it felt like his soul was being torn open and stitched back together simultaneously. The being's light began to contract again, folding inward. Caleb reached out instinctively, his hand trembling. "Wait," he said. "Please, I don't understand. What am I supposed to do?" The thought came one last time, softer now, almost tender. "Live, love. Remember, the harvest is not coming. It is already here, and you, Caleb Warren, are part of it." Then the light collapsed into a single point, brilliant and blinding, and vanished. The field went dark. The stars resumed their usual distant glow. The wind returned, soft and cool, rustling through the wheat. Caleb stood alone, his hands still outstretched, his body trembling. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was ordinary. The world had returned to normal, except nothing would ever be normal again. He stumbled back through the field, his mind a chaotic storm of thoughts, images, and emotions he couldn't untangle. By the time he reached the house, the sky had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He sat on the porch steps, staring at his hands, wondering if he'd lost his mind. But deep down, he knew he hadn't. What he'd experienced was real, more real than anything he'd felt in years. The being's words echoed in his skull, relentless and undeniable. The rapture has already begun. Over the following days, Caleb tried to return to his routine. He fed the cows, tended the chickens, checked the irrigation, but everything felt different. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. When he touched the wheat, he swore he could feel a faint vibration beneath his fingertips, as though the plants themselves were humming. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter over and over. He told no one. Who would believe him? Even he wasn't sure he believed himself. But the signs continued. Small things at first. Lights flickering in the barn, shadows moving where nothing cast them, a persistent ringing in his ears that faded only when he prayed, and the dreams. Every night, the same vision, the earth wrapped in threads of light, people glowing, the veil dissolving. On the 7th day after the encounter, something happened that shattered any remaining doubt. He was working in the barn, repairing a broken stall, when one of the cows, an old Jersey named Clementine, collapsed. Her legs buckled, and she fell heavily onto her side, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Caleb rushed to her, panic surging. She was 18 years old, well past her prime, but still strong. This was sudden, too sudden. He knelt beside her, running his hands over her neck, checking for injury. Her eyes were wide, glazed, staring at nothing. Her breathing slowed. He knew that look. He'd seen it before with Lily. It was the look of something slipping away. "No," he whispered. "Not you too." Without thinking, he placed both hands on her side, just over her heart, and then, something extraordinary happened. Heat flooded through his palm, not painful, but intense, like holding his hands too close to a fire. Light poured from his fingertips, faint but unmistakable, soaking into Clementine's fur. She shuddered once, then went still. For a moment, Caleb thought she was dead. Then her chest rose, a deep, full breath. Her eyes cleared. Slowly, impossibly, she lifted her head, then stood, steady and strong, as though nothing had happened. Caleb staggered backward, staring at his hands. They looked normal, ordinary, but he'd felt it. The light, the energy, whatever it was, flowing through him. He looked at Clementine. She was chewing her cud contentedly, completely unbothered. His legs gave out and he sat hard on the barn floor, his mind blank with shock. The harvest is already here, and you, Caleb Warren, are part of it. From that moment, everything changed. Caleb began to notice things he'd never seen before, or perhaps things he'd always seen but never understood. The way light bent around certain people when they smiled, the faint glow that surrounded children playing in the park, the shadows that clung to others, heavy and thick, as though their grief or anger had become visible. He started going back to church, sitting quietly in the back pew, listening to Reverend Matthews preach about sin and salvation. But the words felt hollow now. The truth the being had shown him was so much larger, so much stranger than anything contained in doctrine or dogma. One Sunday, after the service, old Mrs. Hanley approached him. She was 93, bent with age, her hands gnarled by arthritis. She smiled at him, her eyes warm. "It's good to see you back, Caleb," she said. He nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." She reached out and touched his hand, and the moment her skin met his, he felt it, a pulse of light, faint but unmistakable, flowing from him into her. Her eyes widened slightly, and for just an instant, he saw her as she truly was, radiant, timeless, a being of pure light, wearing the costume of an old woman. Then the moment passed, and she was just Mrs. Hanley again, but her smile had deepened. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she whispered. Caleb froze. "Seen what?" "The light, the truth, the way things really are." His heart hammered. "How do you—" She squeezed his hand gently. "We're not as alone as we think, dear. Some of us have always known. We've just been waiting for the others to remember." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, slow and steady, leaving him standing in the churchyard with more questions than answers. That night, he wrote everything down, the encounter, the visions, the healing, Mrs. Hanley's words, filling page after page in a notebook he'd found in Lily's old desk. He didn't know why he was writing it, or for whom, but it felt necessary, like planting seeds for a harvest he wouldn't live to see. Weeks passed. The nights grew colder. The wheat turned gold, ready for harvest. And every evening, Caleb stood in his field, watching the star, waiting. The being never returned, but its presence lingered, woven into the fabric of his daily life. He felt it in the wind, heard it in the silence, saw it in the faces of strangers. The rapture wasn't a single event. It was a slow unfurling, a gradual awakening happening all around him, invisible to most but undeniable to those who had eyes to see. And Caleb Warren, a simple farmer in the middle of Nebraska, had become one of them. He no longer feared death. He no longer mourned Lily the way he once had, because he understood now she hadn't gone anywhere. She had simply shifted frequencies, crossing a threshold he hadn't yet reached, but was walking toward with every breath. The harvest was underway, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still and the stars hummed their ancient song, Caleb would whisper a prayer, not to a distant God in the cloud, but to the light he now knew lived inside him, inside everyone, waiting to be remembered. "Let me be ready," he would say. "When the veil falls, let me be ready." And somewhere, in the space between earth and eternity, the being heard him and smiled. The winter came like a thief in the night, stealing away the last remnants of autumn's warmth and wrapping the plains in a blanket of silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Caleb Warren no longer slept through the nights. He would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle and creak, feeling the pulse beneath everything, that strange, rhythmic hum that had never left him since the encounter. It lived in his bones now, a second heartbeat that synchronized with something vast and unseen. Sometimes, in those quiet hours before dawn, he would place his hand over his chest and feel both beats, his human heart, steady and finite, and beneath it, something else, older, infinite, timeless. The notebook he'd started had grown thick with entries, page after page filled with observations, questions, fragments of dreams, and attempts to articulate the ineffable. He wrote about the light he'd seen pouring from his hands when he'd healed Clementine. He wrote about Mrs. Hanley's knowing smile and her whispered words, "We're not as alone as we think." He wrote about the way certain people seemed to glow when he looked at them in a particular state of awareness, as though his eyes had learned to see beyond the visible spectrum. But mostly, he wrote about the loneliness of knowing, because that was the hardest part, carrying this revelation inside him like an ember, unable to share it with anyone who would truly understand. When he tried to put it into words, they came out sounding either insane or blasphemous. The few times he'd attempted to speak about it, carefully, obliquely, to neighbors or acquaintances, he'd been met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. People didn't want to hear about aliens or raptures or the veil between worlds growing thin. They wanted to talk about crop yields and weather patterns and who was selling their land to the corporate farms moving in from the east. So Caleb learned to keep his silence. He became a keeper of secrets, a witness to miracles no one else could see. December arrived with heavy snowfall that buried the fields under 3 feet of white. The wheat, dormant now, slept beneath the frozen ground, waiting for spring's resurrection. Caleb spent his days maintaining the property, clearing snow from walkways, ensuring the barn stayed warm enough for the cattle, fixing machinery that always seemed to break at the worst possible time. The work was grueling but meditative. His hands stayed busy while his mind wandered through the labyrinth of questions that had no answers. The being had told him the rapture had already begun, that it was a remembering rather than an escape. But what did that mean in practical terms? If the harvest was underway, where were people going? When Mrs. Hanley had looked at him with those knowing eyes, had she already crossed some invisible threshold? And what about him? Was he changing, transforming into something other than human? Or was he simply becoming more fully what he'd always been? The questions circled endlessly, unanswerable. Then came the night of December 19th, when everything shifted again. Caleb had driven into town that afternoon to pick up supplies, salt for the icy driveway, feed for the animals, and a few groceries to get him through the week. Harlan looked like a postcard in winter, its main street lined with bare trees wrapped in Christmas lights, storefronts decorated with wreaths and painted snow scenes. The general store had a nativity set in the window, the plastic figures faded from years of sun but still recognizable. Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, the shepherds, the wise men, and above them a star made of yellow tinsel. Caleb had paused at that window longer than he intended, staring at the star. Once, it had been just a decoration, a symbol of a story he'd heard so many times it had lost its power. But now, after what he'd experienced, he wondered. Had the Star of Bethlehem been something like what he'd seen in his field? A light that wasn't quite light, a presence that bent the laws of physics because it came from somewhere those laws didn't apply? Beautiful, isn't it? He turned to find Sarah Mitchell standing beside him. She was the town librarian, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that held more depth than most people bothered to notice. Caleb had known her peripherally for years. She'd been friends with Lily, had brought books to the house during those final terrible months when Lily could no longer leave her bed. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Beautiful." Sarah smiled, but it was a sad smile, weighted with something he couldn't quite identify. "Do you believe in it?" she asked. "The star, the wise men, all of it?" It was such a strange question to ask in the middle of Main Street, casual yet profound. Caleb considered his answer carefully. "I believe something happened," he said finally. "Something that changed the world, but I don't think it happened the way we've been told." Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. No, I think..." He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I think the truth is bigger than the story, more complicated, more miraculous, maybe in ways we don't have words for." For a long moment, Sarah just looked at him, and in that look, Caleb felt the same recognition he'd felt with Mrs. Hanley, as though she could see past his words into the truth he was dancing around. "Have you seen them?" she asked quietly. His heart stopped. Seen who? The messengers, the lights in the fields, the beings that don't quite fit in our world. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. I saw one 20 years ago, out by the old quarry. Changed my life. I've been waiting ever since, watching for others who've seen them too. Caleb's hands began to tremble. He shoved them in his pockets. Why? He managed. Because we're the ones who remember, Sarah said. Or we're starting to anyway. And when enough of us remember, the veil will fall completely. That's what mine told me. That's what they've always been telling us, in every age, through every prophet and mystic and madman who's ever claimed to have seen beyond. She paused, studying his face. You've seen one recently, haven't you? That's why you came back to church. Why you look different now. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And the relief Caleb felt at being seen, truly seen, was so overwhelming he thought his legs might give out. October 17th, he said hoarsely, in my north field. It told me. It said the rapture has already begun, that it's not what we think, that it's happening now, slowly, person by person. Sarah nodded as though this confirmed something she'd long suspected. They told me the same thing, just in different words. They said humanity is waking from a long sleep, that we're remembering what we forgot when we fell into matter. Not a fall from grace, but a fall into forgetting. And the rapture, the harpazo, the catching away, it's the remembering, the return to our true nature. But people aren't vanishing, Caleb said, frustration bleeding into his voice. The world is still here. Nothing looks different, doesn't it? Sarah's gaze was gentle but challenging. Look closer, Caleb. Really look. People are changing even if they don't realize it. Some are getting lighter, brighter. Others are getting heavier, denser, as though they're sinking deeper into the forgetting. It's a separation, but not the kind the preachers talk about. Not sheep and goats. More like frequencies diverging. Some souls are tuning up, others tuning down, and eventually the distance between them will become too great to bridge. Caleb thought about the glowing children in the park, the shadows clinging to angry men at the gas station, the way Mrs. Hanley had looked simultaneously ancient and ageless. Sarah was right. The world was changing. He just hadn't known how to see it until now. What do we do? He asked. We live, Sarah said simply. We love, we stay awake, we help others wake up when they're ready. That's all the messengers ever ask of us. Not to preach or convince, but to be. To embody the light so others can recognize it when they're ready to see. They talked for another hour, standing there on the snowy sidewalk like conspirators sharing dangerous truths. Sarah told him about the others she'd found over the years, scattered across the county, mostly older folks, a few younger ones, all of them carrying the same secret knowledge. They didn't meet formally or call themselves anything. They were just people who'd seen beyond the veil and were quietly, patiently holding space for the transformation to unfold. You should come to my house sometime, Sarah said as they parted ways. There are books I think you'd find helpful, old texts, mystical traditions, accounts from people throughout history who've experienced what you're experiencing. You're not alone in this, Caleb. You never were. Driving home that evening, Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic change, but a subtle relaxation, like a fist unclenching after years of holding tight. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't alone. There were others who knew, who saw, who understood. The isolation that had been crushing him since the encounter began to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. But that night, the dreams changed. He'd been having the same vision for weeks. The earth wrapped in threads of light, people glowing, the veil dissolving. But tonight the dream went deeper. He found himself standing in a vast space that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a kind of cosmic threshold. All around him, figures of light moved in silence. Some ascending, growing brighter and less substantial, others descending, growing darker and more solid. He realized he was watching the separation Sarah had described, the great sorting that was happening beneath the surface of ordinary reality. Then he saw Lily. She stood among the ascending ones, radiant and whole, more beautiful than she'd ever been in life. Her eyes met his across the impossible distance, and he felt her love wash over him like a wave. She didn't speak, but he heard her anyway, in that same wordless language the being had used. I'm here, Caleb. I never left. I'm just on the other side of the veil. And you're coming. Not yet, but soon. When you're ready. When you've finished what you came to do." He tried to reach for her, but his arm wouldn't move. She smiled. That same gentle smile he'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. And then she turned and continued ascending, growing brighter and brighter until she dissolved into pure light. Caleb woke with tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with sobs. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of recognition, of reunion, of absolute certainty that death was not an ending, but a transformation. Lily wasn't gone. She just shifted frequencies. And someday, when his own frequency rose high enough, he would join her. The knowing settled into his bone, unshakable. Over the following weeks, Caleb's life took on a strange double quality. On the surface, everything continued as normal. He worked the farm, attended church, made small talk with neighbors. But beneath the surface, he was living in a completely different reality. His awareness had split, allowing him to perceive both the material world and the luminous world simultaneously. He began visiting Sarah regularly. Her home was a small cottage on the edge of town, its walls lined with bookshelves stuffed with volumes on mysticism, theology, cosmology, and ancient wisdom traditions. She lent him books by Meister Eckhart, Teilhard de Chardin, Rumi, and others who'd tried to articulate the ineffable. He read voraciously, hungry for context, for lineage, for proof that what he was experiencing fit into a larger pattern of human awakening. "Every age has its harvesters," Sarah told him one snowy afternoon as they sat by her fireplace drinking tea. "People who serve as bridges between the worlds. You're one of them now, Caleb. Whether you chose it or it chose you doesn't really matter. What matters is that you honor the gift." "But I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it," he admitted. "You'll know when the time comes," she said with quiet certainty. "The work finds you. You don't have to go looking for it." And she was right. The first time it happened was in late January. Caleb was at the feed store, loading bags of grain into his truck, when he saw a young woman sitting on the curb outside, crying. She couldn't have been more than 25, thin and pale, her eyes red and swollen. Something about her pulled at him, not her beauty or her distress, but a frequency he felt resonating from her, a particular pitch of desperation that his soul recognized. He walked over slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, you okay?" She looked up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm fine, just having a bad day. Want to talk about it?" She laughed, a bitter sound. "You don't want to hear my problems. Trust me. Try me." Maybe it was the kindness in his voice, or maybe she was simply too exhausted to keep pretending. But she started talking. Her name was Emma. She'd lost her brother to an overdose 2 months ago. Her parents blamed her because she'd been the one who introduced him to the friend who'd given him the pills. Her marriage was falling apart. She'd stopped believing in God, or anything really, because what kind of universe would allow so much pointless suffering? Caleb listened without interrupting, and as she spoke, he felt that familiar heat building in his chest. The same energy that had flowed through his hands when he'd healed Clementine. Without thinking about it, he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. The moment he made contact, light poured from his palm into her. He felt it leave him like a river breaking through a dam, and he saw her aura, gray and tangled with grief, suddenly brighten. Her eyes widened. She gasped. "What did you just—" She couldn't finish the question. "I don't know," Caleb said honestly, "but I think you're going to be okay. I think your brother is okay too. Not gone, just somewhere else. Somewhere you can't see yet, but will eventually." Emma stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Then, slowly, her face crumpled and she began crying again. But these tears were different, cleaner, like something toxic was draining out of her. Caleb stayed with her until the tears subsided, then helped her to her feet. "Go home," he said gently. "Rest. Things are going to get better. Not all at once, but gradually, you'll see." She nodded, still dazed, and walked away. Caleb watched her go, his hand still tingling with residual energy. He didn't know what he'd done or how he'd done it, but he knew with absolute certainty that something had shifted in her. A door had opened, a light had been turned on, the work had found him. After that, it happened more and more frequently. People would appear in his life seemingly by chance, at the grocery store, the gas station, the post office, and he would feel that pull, that recognition. He would talk to them, and if they were open, if their souls were ready, he would touch them and the energy would flow. Sometimes it was dramatic. A healing, a revelation, a sudden lifting of despair. More often it was subtle, just a moment of connection, a spark of recognition, a gentle nudge toward awakening. He never tried to convert anyone or preach. He simply showed up, present and available, and let the light do its work. By February, word had begun to spread in quiet ways. People who'd experienced something through him would tell others, not in dramatic terms, but in whispers. Talk to Caleb Warren. He helped me when I was at my lowest. I don't know how, but he did. Sarah heard the stories and smiled. You're becoming what you were always meant to be, she told him. A conduit, a harvester, one of the ones who helps others cross the threshold when they're ready. But with the gifts came challenges. Not everyone was ready to wake up. Some people's souls were too dense, too invested in their suffering or their stories or their comfortable numbness. When Caleb tried to connect with them, he would hit a wall, a resistance so strong it felt physical. And afterward, he would feel drained, depleted, as though he'd been trying to pour water into a vessel with no opening. You can't force it, Sarah warned him. The harvest happens in its own time. Some seeds sprout quickly, others take years, and some never sprout at all in this lifetime. That's not failure. That's just the nature of souls. Still, the failures haunted him. There was a man named David Ross, a farmer 3 miles down the road, whose wife had left him and taken the kids. Caleb had reached out, had tried to offer comfort, but David's bitterness was so thick Caleb couldn't penetrate it. 2 weeks later, David put a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. When Caleb heard the news, he wept for hours, wondering if he could have done something differently, said something better, tried harder. Sarah found him that evening, sitting on his porch in the freezing cold, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking, just holding space, until finally he said, I failed him. No, Sarah said firmly. You offered. He refused. That was his choice, Caleb. Souls have agency. Sometimes they choose the darkness, not because they're evil, but because they're not ready for the light. It's too painful, too exposing. They'd rather end it than transform. That's tragic, but it's not your fault. Then what's the point? Caleb's voice cracked. If we can't save everyone, what's the point of any of this? You save the ones you can, Sarah said. You light the lamps you're given to light, and you trust that the harvest is bigger than any individual soul, bigger than success or failure. The rapture isn't about rescuing everyone. It's about those who choose to awaken actually having the support and guidance to do so. You're not a savior, Caleb. You're a midwife. You help birth the new consciousness in those who are ready to give birth. That's enough. That has to be enough. Her words sank into him slowly, and eventually he nodded. She was right. He couldn't save everyone, but he could show up day after day, available and open, trusting that the ones who needed him would find him, and the ones who didn't would find their own path, in this life or the next. March arrived with the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing the dormant fields beneath. Caleb started preparing for planting season, tilling the soil, checking equipment, ordering seeds. The rhythms of the farm grounded him, reminded him that transformation was a natural process. Seeds died to become plants. Plants died to become food. Food died to become bodies. Bodies died to become something else. Everything was always in motion, always changing, always being harvested and replanted in new forms. The being had told him the harvest was already underway. Now he understood what that meant. It wasn't a single event, but an ongoing process. Souls ripening, some ascending to higher frequencies, others descending to lower ones, and a few, like him, serving as bridges to help the ascension happen more consciously, more gracefully. He was part of something ancient and immense, a pattern woven into the fabric of reality itself. One warm afternoon in late March, Caleb was working in his field when he felt it again, that familiar pulse, that strange thickening of the air. He straightened, his heart racing, and looked toward the horizon. The light was back, not in the same place as before, but closer, hovering just beyond the fence line at the edge of his property. He walked toward it slowly, reverently, his boots crunching on the half-frozen ground. The light pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, welcoming him, and as he approached, it began to take shape once more. Not the same being as before. This one felt different, gentler, more feminine in its energy, but clearly from the same source. When he was 10 feet away, the thought came. "You have done well, Caleb Warren." The words filled him with warmth. He hadn't realized how much he'd been longing for validation, for confirmation that he wasn't just making this up, that his efforts mattered. "The threshold you guard is holding," the being continued. "Many have crossed because of you. Many more will cross in the time that remains." "How much time?" Caleb asked aloud, his voice hoarse. "Enough. The harvest accelerates now. What took centuries before will take decades. What took decades will take years. What took years will take months. The veil is thinning rapidly. Soon, the separation will be complete. And then what? Then two worlds where there was one. Two humanities where there was one. Those who have awakened will live in the reality of light. Those who have not will live in the reality of shadow. Not as punishment, but as natural consequence. Frequency determines reality. You will dwell in the frequency you embody. Caleb thought about this. Is that hell? The reality of shadow? Hell is not a place, the being said. It is a state of consciousness. The absence of light is not punishment imposed from without, but the natural result of refusing to awaken. Those who dwell there have chosen it, consciously or unconsciously, by clinging to fear, hatred, separation. They will remain until they are ready to let go. And when they are ready, messengers will come for them too, in that realm, offering the same choice you were offered. So everyone eventually awakens? All souls return home eventually, the being said. The question is not if, but when, and how much suffering they will endure before they choose to remember. Your species is young, Caleb. You think in terms of single lifetimes. We think in terms of aeon. From our perspective, every soul is already home. They just don't know it yet. The profundity of this struck Caleb like a physical blow. If what the being said was true, then salvation wasn't about belief or behavior or belonging to the right religion. It was simply about waking up to what was already true, about remembering what had been forgotten, about returning to a home that had never actually been left. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why was I chosen to see this?" "You chose this before you incarnated," the being replied. "Every harvester does. You volunteered to forget so you could remember and then help others remember. It is the most loving thing a soul can do, to descend into forgetting for the sake of guiding others back to remembrance." Tears streamed down Caleb's face. He thought of all the pain he'd endured, losing Lily, the years of grief, the loneliness, the doubt. Had he really chosen this? Before he was born, had some higher version of himself looked at this life and said, "Yes, I'll take that burden. I'll carry that cross. For the sake of the harvest." "You did," the being confirmed, reading his thought. "And you have carried it beautifully. Now the final stage begins." "What final stage?" "The visible miracle. Until now, your work has been subtle, hidden, known only to those directly affected. But as the veil thins, the light will become impossible to hide. Miracles will multiply. Healings will occur in public. The dead will return to life, not as resurrection, but as souls who crossed too early choosing to return. The signs will intensify until even the most stubborn skeptics will have to acknowledge that something is happening. When? Soon. Before this year ends, the world will know, and you, Caleb Warren, will be called to witness publicly. Do not fear. When the time comes, the words will be given to you. The power will flow through you. All you must do is remain available, remain open, remain willing. The light began to fade, but this time Caleb didn't reach out to stop it. He simply stood in the presence, absorbing it, letting it fill every cell of his body until he felt like a battery charged to capacity. "Go in peace," the being said. "And remember, you are never alone. We are always with you, even when you cannot see us." The harvest continues, the awakening accelerates, and love, always love, is what carries souls across the threshold. Then it was gone, and Caleb stood alone in his field, the spring breeze cool against his wet cheeks, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. The months that followed were unlike anything Caleb had ever experienced. The being's words proved prophetic. The miracles intensified, became more frequent, more visible, harder to dismiss as coincidence or delusion. In April, a woman named Rachel brought her son to him. The boy was 8 years old and had been born deaf. She'd heard stories about Caleb, whispered accounts of impossible healings, and though she was skeptical, desperation had made her bold. Caleb placed his hands on the boy's ears, felt the now familiar surge of energy, and watched as the child's eyes widened. The boy grabbed his mother's arm and whispered his first words. "Mama, I can hear you." Rachel collapsed, sobbing. Within a week, half the county knew. In May, an elderly man dying of cancer asked Caleb to visit him in the hospital. Caleb sat beside his bed, held his hand, and felt the light pour into him. Not healing the body, which was too far gone, but healing the soul, easing the transition. The man died peacefully that night, but 3 nurses reported seeing his room fill with light at the moment of passing, and one swore she saw angels, or beings that looked like angels, standing at the foot of his bed. In June, a tornado touched down outside Harlan, heading straight for the town. Caleb, working in his field, felt an overwhelming impulse to stand at the edge of his property and raise his hands. He did, and the tornado, impossibly against all meteorological logic, split in 2, passing on either side of town without causing damage. The weather service had no explanation. Caleb said nothing, but those who'd seen him standing there, arms raised like Moses parting the sea, began to call him a prophet. He hated the word. He wasn't a prophet. He was just a man who'd seen beyond the veil and been asked to serve as a bridge. But language was imperfect, and people needed labels to make sense of the inexplicable. By July, people were coming from hundreds of miles away, parking their cars along his property line, hoping for a miracle. Caleb tried to accommodate them all, but it was overwhelming. Some days he would spend 12 hours just touching people, praying with them, channeling energy until he was so depleted he could barely stand. Sarah helped manage the crowds, screening those who were truly desperate from those who were merely curious. She became his gatekeeper, his protector, his closest friend and confidant, and together they held space for the harvest that was accelerating all around them. But not everyone was grateful. Some religious leaders in town began preaching against him, calling him a false prophet, a servant of Satan disguised as an angel of light. They cited scripture about the end times, warning their congregations to stay away from anyone performing signs and wonders not sanctioned by the church. A few even organized protests outside his property, holding signs that read, "False prophet," and "Repent before it's too late." Caleb endured it all with grace. He understood their fear. The old world was dying, and they were clinging to its corpse, unable to see that something new was being born. He felt compassion for them, even as they condemned him. Then came August 15th, the day everything changed permanently. Caleb was in town buying groceries when he felt a massive surge of energy ripple through him, so strong it dropped him to his knees in the middle of the parking lot. People rushed over thinking he was having a heart attack, but he waved them away. He wasn't in pain. He was receiving information, energy. Knowing was pouring into him like a waterfall, and he could barely contain it. When it subsided, he stood shakily and looked around. The world looked different. He could see the luminous layer clearly now, without effort. Every person glowing or shadowed according to their frequency, threads of light connecting awakened souls, the veil so thin it was translucent. And in the sky, visible to anyone who cared to look, a strange light had appeared. Not the sun, not the moon. Something else, pulsing softly on the horizon like a second dawn. Others saw it too. Within hours, reports were flooding social media. Strange lights in the sky, visible worldwide, appearing and disappearing without explanation. Scientists scrambled for answers. Religious leaders called emergency meetings. Governments issued statements urging calm. But Caleb knew exactly what it was. The veil was finally dissolving. The separation was accelerating. The harvest had entered its final phase. That night, the being returned one last time. Not just one, but many. Dozens of them, filling his field with light so bright it turned night into day. Neighbors reported seeing it from miles away. A pillar of fire rising from Caleb Warren's farm, reaching toward the stars. Caleb stood in the center of it all, unafraid, his arms spread wide, receiving the final transmission. The time of witnessing is complete, they told him. Now comes the time of choosing. Every soul will be given a clear choice in the months ahead. To awaken or remain asleep, to ascend or descend, to cross the threshold or turn away. No one will be forced. No one will be condemned, but everyone will decide, consciously or unconsciously, which frequency they will embody. "And what about me?" Caleb asked. "You will continue to serve," they said, "until your body gives out or your work is finished, whichever comes first. You are a lighthouse, Caleb Warren, a beacon for those navigating the storm. Shine until you cannot shine anymore. That is your purpose. That is your gift." The lights began to ascend, rising slowly into the sky, and as they did, Caleb felt something shift inside him one final time. Not a healing or an awakening, but a completion. Everything he'd been through, the grief, the encounter, the gifts, the service, had been preparation for this moment. And now he was ready to be who he'd always been meant to be. The lights vanished. The field returned to darkness, but Caleb no longer felt alone. He felt connected to the earth beneath him, to the stars above, to every awakened soul across the planet, to Lily waiting on the other side, to the vast intelligence that held everything together in love. He walked back to his house slowly, peacefully, and for the first time in years, he slept deeply and dreamlessly. When he woke, the sun was rising over the wheat fields, painting them gold. He made coffee, sat on his porch, and watched the world wake up. Somewhere in town, people were already starting their days, working, worrying, loving, suffering, dying, being born. The great cycle continuing as it always had. But beneath the surface, invisible to most, the harvest was accelerating. Souls were ripening. Frequencies were diverging. The veil was thinning. And Caleb Warren, a simple farmer who'd once been nothing but grief and questions, sat at the center of it all, holding space for the transformation, one soul at a time. The rapture had already begun, not with trumpets or clouds or dramatic ascensions, but quietly, gracefully, gently, like wheat being gathered into barns at the end of a long season. And though Caleb didn't know when his own harvest would come, he knew with absolute certainty that when it did, he would be ready. Because heaven wasn't somewhere he had to go. It was the light that appeared when he finally stopped running. Truth or fiction? Perhaps even the one who told this story no longer knows. Here, stories exist, not to prove, but to awaken. The miraculous reveals itself only to those who feel, never to those who demand certainty.